I don't know where to start on this record. The Beatles, timeless. The Beatles at number 31 on my up 8 from 39 on my fancy playlist, September 6, 1986, with Twist and Shout. Re-released in 1986, it was featured in the movie Ferris Bueller's Day Off. And by the way, here's a little surprise for you. Guess who was a fan of that movie? Ronald Reagan, President Ronald Reagan. I read it in a book called The Reagans at the Movies or something like that. It's a book that came out earlier this year, and the Reagans enjoyed that movie. Ferris Bueller's Day Off. That's where Twist and Shout was featured in that movie. It was re-released. Went to number 23, I think, in 1986. This is like the second time around, though, on Billboard's Hot 100. And let's go back. I got to talk to you about the history of this record. Twist and Shout was originally done by an R&B group in Philadelphia called the Top Notes in 1961. The Isley Brothers picked it up, had a hit with it in 1962. The Beatles heard the Isley Brothers version of that record. Norman Smith. I'll talk about Norman Smith in just a minute. Norman Smith, who worked as an engineer on a lot of the Beatles' early recordings, up to Rubber Soul. This is the story that he told. Actually, I'm going to bring together a couple of stories that I read about this record, and this is basically what I learned about Twist and Shout. The group was sore. Their throats were sore. Here's the deal. Someone has suggested maybe you guys ought to do Twist and Shout. Cover the Isley Brothers song. The Beatles were at the tail end of a 12-hour session. 12 hours. Rehearsing, singing, recording. Their throats were sore. John Lennon's voice was just about gone. He was sick. He had a cold. At one point, I believe during the recording of Twist and Shout, he took his shirt off to sweat out his cold. They had to get this song down in one take, at least two takes. And John Lennon, he took a couple of throat lozenges. They were called Cubes, 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 rhymes with cubes. Gurgled some milk, and it was off to the races. One source has it that the song was done in one take, but I saw another source that said the song was done in two takes, and the first take was used. So I'll go with that one. Now I got to talk about Norman Smith. And this is for you rock and roll geeks out there. For you casual listeners, you probably couldn't care less. Norman Smith, well, as already mentioned, he engineered. He worked as an engineer. I guess it's sort of like an assistant to George Martin, the producer. He's worked on about 100 Beatles records, early EMI recordings, up to about 1965. And he worked with Pink Floyd. Norman Smith worked with Pink Floyd. He produced their first 4 albums. And one of the songs that he produced, one of the early Pink Floyd's British hits, it was See Emily Play. Just added that to my Spotify playlist. Brilliant psychedelic record produced by Norman Smith. Norman Smith produced one of the first, maybe not the first, but one of the first rock and roll concept albums. It was by a group. Now, if you're watching this video in England, you probably remember the Pretty Things, the group called the Pretty Things. The Pretty Things, I believe it's their fourth album, S.F. Sorrow, produced by Norman Smith. Guy was a producer, engineer, genius, Norman Smith. Just listen to a song by the Pretty Things off that album, S.F. Sorrow's Born, or something like that. Psychedelic. Some spicy guitar licks, that 60s psychedelic DNA coming into play on that record. God, but no impact here in the States, though. very obscure record, very obscure album here in the States. Maybe a little bit better known in England, particularly among the rock and roll aficionados over there. But here's the thing about Norman Smith. As Gomer Pyle would say, surprise, surprise, surprise. Norman Smith branched out, did some recordings in the early 70s. In 1971, he came out with a song in England. The song was called Don't Let It Die. That went to #2 in Britain, 1971. Might have been produced by Mickey Most. Then, okay, bring it here to the States. For you people here in the States, the USA, oh babe, what would you say? Norman Smith, under the moniker Hurricane Smith, the guy who engineered those early Beatles recordings and who, well, kind of discovered and recorded Pink Floyd's early albums and recorded that concept album by the Pretty Things, going back nostalgically to the ballroom days, the big band days with Oh Babe, What Would You Say? Christmas 1972 hit here in the States by Hurricane Norman Smith. Doesn't that just blow you away? He was 50 years old when he came out with that song. Well, he served as an engineer. He was in the control room when the Beatles recorded Twist and Shout. The Beatles were there on the studio floor recording Twist and Shout, and Norman Smith was in the control room, presumably with George Martin, the producer. Twist and Shout by the Beatles at number 31. Fantasy Playlist, September 6, 1986.